now I've had a little bit more to drink than I thought I should. So it's going to be a good show, okay? All right. It looks like they're about ready. So this first one is called The Miniaturist. Woo!
Harad IV, there lived at court a maker of miniatures who was celebrated for the uncanny perfection of his work. It was said that no matter how closely you examined one of the master's little pieces, you always discovered some further wonder. Foremost among the many tasks of the maker of miniatures was replacing the furnishings of the old toy palace, which the king had inherited from his father. The famous toy palace, with its more than 600 rooms, its dungeons and secret passageways, gardens and courtyards and orchards, rose to the height of a man's chest and occupied its own chamber. He was assisted by 2 youthful apprentices. They roughed out the larger miniatures, but were not permitted to attempt the more difficult labors of the miniaturist's art, such as carving the dragon's heads at the feet of table legs, or forging the minuscule copper keys that turned the locks of drawers and chests. One day after the completion of an arduous and exhilarating task, he'd made for one of the miniature orchards a basket of brilliantly lifelike apples, each no larger than the pit of a cherry, and had placed on the stem of one apple perfectly reproduced copper fly. The maker of miniatures felt in himself a stirring of restlessness. The basket had been unusually satisfying to make, because it had presented him with a hierarchy of sizes: the basket itself, then the apples, and at last the fly. This tiny fly had caused him the most difficulty and the most joy, and it occurred to him that there was no particular reason to stop at the fly. Suddenly he was seized by an inner trembling. Didn't logic itself demand that the downward series be pursued? At this thought he felt a deep, guilty excitement. He set out to make an apple basket the size of one of his apples. But even as he struggled pleasurably over each apple, he realized that he was dreaming of the fly, the impossible fly that, as it turned out, was visible only as a speck on the minuscule stem, though it was perfect in every detail when viewed through the glass. With new zest, the master devoted himself to a series of miniatures that in every way surpassed his finest efforts of the past. He soon presented to the king a saucer on which stood an inverted ebony thimble. When the king picked up the thimble, he discovered beneath it a meticulous reproduction of the northwest wing of his toy palace, with 26 rooms fully furnished, including a gold birdcage containing a nightingale. Scarcely had the maker of miniatures completed the thimble palace when he felt a new burst of restlessness. He proposed to himself a plunge beneath the surface of the visible, the creation of a detailed world wholly inaccessible to the naked eye. He began with simple things: a copper bowl, a beechwood box, for the material he worked with was, before magnification, itself invisible, and required of him a new degree of delicate manipulation. His first masterpiece in the realm of the invisible was a stag with branching antlers. Through a powerful glass, he watched the invisible sharpen into the visible, the head twisted to one side, the mouth slightly open, and the lips drawn back to reveal the teeth. No sooner had he finished the stag than he embarked on a far more challenging task: an invisible garden containing dozens of 12-sided flower beds, 14 varieties of fruit tree with individual leaves, a system of crossing paths paved with tesserae of ebony and ivory, onyx fountains carved with legendary creatures, snails under stones. Although the king expressed wonder and amazement at the garden seen through the glass, praised the master's conquest of a new world, he asked many questions about the lens in the box, as if he suspected them of working a spell. Still, he felt at the back of his mind a slight itching. Although he now worked with material so minute that it was invisible to the unaided eye, it remained small that they would escape the power of the mediating glass, remain submerged in the dark kingdom of the invisible. He began as always with a simple object, an oblong ivory box with a sliding top. Although the box was so marvelously small that it remained invisible even through the glass, he continued to make use of his teakwood viewer, where the familiar apparatus served to concentrate his attention and steady his fingers. The ivory box was completed in 7 days. With his inner eye, he contemplated it coolly and felt a calm elation. Despite the absence of visible evidence, he was certain of its formal perfection, of the elegant precision of its parts. Never had he taken so much care. Immediately, he threw himself into a more ambitious task, a beechwood peacock with outspread tail. The enchanting peacock radio with unseen colors took him nearly 3 weeks, and when he was done, he felt ready for the task he had secretly been preparing for, an imaginary kingdom. And so he set to work on his invisible kingdom, with its walled cities and winding rivers, its forests of beech and fir, its copper mines and temple towers, its spoons and insects. By the end of a year, he had completed a single city. The city contained cobble streets, market squares, merchants' houses with pilloried balconies overlooking courtyards, individual bottles, and the glassblowers' shops. He felt tired and exhilarated, and as he imagined all that remained undone, he found himself wishing that he could reveal his as he had once been able to do. The king no longer summoned him, and his apprentices had moved into an adjoining chamber and taken on apprentices of their own. One afternoon, when he was deep sunk in his invisible kingdom, there was a rap at the door of his chamber. Half raising his head from the teakwood box, the maker of miniatures called to enter. The door opened to admit the 2 new apprentices. They began by apologizing for disturbing the master at work, but explained that they had long admired his unsurpassed art and could not resist the desire to pay the respects and to beg for news of his latest work. Their own work was still crude and trifling, and they hoped that time with the master would instruct and inspire them. The master knew at once that the apprentices were very sure of themselves and were belittling themselves only out of courtly politeness, but the loneliness of his last months was soothed by their words. Giving way to temptation, he moved aside to permit them to view his kingdom through the glass. True, they would be able to see nothing, but perhaps they could somehow sense, as he could, the splendor and precision of his invisible art. The first apprentice bent over his teakwood box. After a few moments, he stepped aside and allowed the second apprentice to bend over the glass. When both had done looking, the younger of the 2 said that the master's work was indeed incomparable. At once, the second apprentice gave voice to his admiration, saying that even in his dreams he had not dared to imagine such loveliness. Then the 2 apprentices thanked the master for dignifying them with his attention, and took their leave. The maker of miniatures, knowing that they had seen nothing, that their words were hollow, that they would never come again, returned with some impatience to his work, and as he sank below the crust of the visible world into his dazzling kingdom, he understood that he had traveled a long way from the early days, that he still had far to go, and that, from now on, his life